Yes, our next way to solve quadratic equations are going to be using something called the zero product property. We're actually going to be using this later on in different methods. So this is kind of the first step, okay, to solving by factoring, which is coming next week, okay? So let's think about this. What does it mean, the zero product property? What do we already know? 0 times anything, right, is equal to 0. We learned that last year, maybe a few years ago. But if we multiply by 0, it's called the zero product property. Multiply anything by 0, it still equals 0. Okay. So let's look at how we could use this for these two quadratic equations. In this case, let's think. This is just a quadratic, right? Let's look at this one. That has been factored, okay? So if I were to distribute, I would have x squared plus 4x equals 0. But we don't know how to solve that, so that wasn't really helpful, but it does show us that this is definitely a quadratic, right? We've got an x squared term. But how do we want to solve this, okay? Let's think, all we're saying is that if we plug in a number for x, right, we want the whole thing to equal 0. So we plug in one number here, and we want it to be equal to 0. And so what the zero product property does is it says, well, if you're multiplying these two things together, if you can get just one of them to 0, right, then the whole thing would be 0. So for example, for this one, if x is 0, right, if x is 0, then we would have 0 times 0 plus 4 equals 0. What is 0 times, this is going to be 4, right? But what's 0 times 4? Just 0, right? So we know that x equals 0 is the solution because we plugged into that. Well, we had to plug in both, but we made sure that one part of the equation equals 0. Now, what about this side? How can we get this to 0? Well, let's just bring it out and set it equal to 0 separately. X plus 4 equals 0. And then solve for x, right? So x equals -4. So now if we plug in -4 to x, what would we get? We would get -4 times -4 plus 4. Well, it's -4 plus 4, right? This is just equal to 0. And what's -4 times 0? It's just 0. Okay, so our solutions here were x equals -4 and x equals 0. When we plugged in, we found it, what would make it 0 when this was 0, or when this side was equal to 0, and then what would make it equal to 0 with this side. And so using that, we can use that on many quadratics, okay? This thing called the zero product property. It just means that we want to get one thing equal to 0, so the whole thing will be 0. So let's look at this over here. We've got x plus 7 times x minus 3 equals 0. And we know that if we distributed this out, right, we would get, or boxed it, whatever you want to do, we would get a quadratic of some sort. It would be x squared something, right? So we need to solve this, and let's use the zero product property, okay? If we can make this 0, the whole thing will be 0. And if we can make this 0, the whole thing will be 0. So let's start with this x plus 7 is equal to 0. Subtract 7, all right, x equals, so that's one solution. And if we were plugging -7 for both these, right, this would be 0. This would be -10, but -10 times 0 is still 0, okay? So that's one solution, right? And then we've got x minus 3 equals 0. So if we solve for x, add 3 to both sides, x equals 3. And we know if we came up here and plugged in 3, we would get 10 times 0. And 10 times 0 is still just 0. So both these, if we plug in either x equals -7 or x equals 3, right, it would make our equation true. So that's how you solve a quadratic using this zero product property. Eventually, we'll have to learn to factor to get it into this already factored form, right? And we already know how to factor. So it's just adding a step we know how to do. But we'll get there next week. So this week, we're just going to look at this and say, using this zero product property, what are my solutions? Okay, let me know if you have any questions.